sitting on the right field.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We're so glad you all could come to tonight's event. Whether we piqued your interest by the title Climate Socialism, or whether you're here because you have an interest in climate change or the Green New Deal, welcome. My name is Natalia Bodner, and I'm the president of ACS, the American Chemical Society. Today, ACS is teaming up with CLO, the Classical Liberal Organization, to provide you a lecture by Dr. Steele. And tonight, I have the distinct privilege of introducing to you Dr. Charles Steele, one of our finest economics professors here at Hillsdale College.
Hey.
Dr. Progressive, I said one.
All right, I will
It's implying that there are many. Dr. Steele is an associate professor and holds the Herman and Susan DeWittler Chair in Economics.
Go ahead.
He is also the chairman of Hillsdale's Economics, Business, and Accounting departments. He has previously taught at the graduate and undergraduate levels in China, Russia, and Ukraine, but decided that Hillsdale College, nestled in one of the smallest towns with its fine weather and students, is a far superior institution. His areas of interest include energy and resource policy, healthcare reform, and the economics of information and uncertainty. He has presented and published a number of articles on the Green New Deal, and you can check them out online if you are interested by this topic. And so with that, I'll leave Dr. Steele to end the Green New Deal.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I didn't mean to kibitz, but I get carried away. So first of all, I want to say thank you to the ACS and to the CLO and to all of you who are attending. I think that there are there's so many other events going on right now. There's almost an event for every student, it seems like. And so I appreciate that you're here tonight. I've spoken a few times on climate policy and climate issues, and I always will start out with a caveat, and I'll do that again. I'm an economist. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a geophysicist, and I don't have professional opinions. I'm not qualified to have professional opinions on those subjects. I've actually taken one college course in climatology, and I passed it. I was an undergraduate, and that's my qualifications on that. And that means that I talk on economics, which is what I'll be doing. Let me go ahead and, can you see how these slides are coming out? Does that help?
Yes.
So let me proceed. Let me start out. In 1991, in the summer 1991, as a graduate student, and I attended a conference on the economics of the environment and economics of resources. Now, if you recall, at that time, the Soviet bloc had already broken up. The Berlin Wall had come down. It was almost down for 2 years. The Soviet Union was on its last legs, and socialism was discredited as an economic system. Several speakers at this conference argued that in the West, socialism, the dream of socialism, was not dead, that it would continue. And that a new line of argument would be that socialism might well be an inferior economic system, but that it would become necessary because of environmental problems. And that would be the new line of argument. Well, this proved to be prophetic. And we now see socialism being promoted as a solution to climate change problems, to anthropogenic global warming. And so my goal here tonight is, first of all, to show that many of the current climate proposals are not really about climate at all. They're actually about getting rid of the market system and replacing it with socialism. Secondary goal would be to first of all, explain why this would destroy modern society, and also why it is not a reasonable solution for climate problems. And let's see, I can figure out my slides here. I wanted to come up with an example. I actually completely changed my slideshow this morning because I had read something about this group, but this is the Extinction Rebellion. There's a young woman, young student who's from Sweden, who has been organizing them walkouts in Europe on climate issues. And this is the group that is behind her project. And it's a quote from one of the founders of the organization. And he does say, he's pretty explicit about the idea that this is something about more, that this project is about something more than fixing the climate. It's more than that. And so this is the kind of thing that we'll be talking about. So that's just one example. But I want to start out and give you an outline of what I'm going to do for my talk, the kinds of things. Yeah, that's it. Next slide. This is what I want to talk about tonight. And so first of all, I want to do a brief introduction into economics. I will not assume that you know much about economics. I know some of you are science students. We've got a nicely mixed group here. But we'll talk a little bit about market allocation versus socialist allocation. And I'll give you some high points of that and what the differences are. I will also then give you some examples of climate socialism. And some will come from economists, some from climate groups, and I'm going to point out that the IPCC's report, SR15, also contains these kinds of proposals in it. And then we will do some analysis I will do some analysis of the Green New Deal to explain how this might be implemented and what the effects might be. Now, so that's, and then we can conclude from that. So we'll have some Q&A. I think we'll have time for it. So I'll start out. This is a generic economic slide. It's not really about, we have to have Adam Smith in the picture. This one is from there's actually a comic, a graphic novel, which is on economics. It's actually pretty good. This is just a page that was taken out of it. But I want to talk just a little bit about the difference between market allocation and socialist allocation. A fundamental issue of economics is allocation. How are resources going to be allocated? How will resources, time, human action be allocated? How is this going to be decided? And by whom will it be decided? And how is this going to be done? The issues that we face in this are, what are the limits to what we can do? What are the constraints that we face? How do we identify what the possibilities are or the opportunities that might be pursued? And also, when we're pursuing these things, how do we ensure or try to ensure that we don't pass up better opportunities or that we don't make things worse? That is to say, in economic jargon, how do we minimize costs while maximizing the good that we do or the good that we accomplish when we're pursuing goals? So, key there. And let me talk a little bit about maximizing gains. And this is the kind of stuff we do in basic economics courses, but we'll go through it here. The idea of a net gain is anytime we undertake actions, the gains from the action, less the cost of those actions, will give us our net. And this is true for any society. It's true for any society at all. If we look at a hunter-gatherer society, go to any society beyond a hunter-gatherer society, we can also characterize it this way. We can look at it as being profit. Profit in a trading economy, excuse me, would be total revenue minus total cost. And I couldn't help myself. I'll put up, I feel like I'm compelled to use mathematics, and it's about as high as the mathematics will get here, but I put it into a little formula. So profit equals total revenue minus total cost. But I put that up as my own little security blanket that I can see. And if this were an economics course, we begin talking about what kind of components might go into this. And we talk about prices and quantities and the behavior of firms, something like this, cost structures, cost functions. We're not going to do that tonight. We'll simply look at this. And I have to say, it's the most boring slide of the night. But in a way, it's also the most important slide of the night because it captures something that's quite important here. Total revenue in a market economy is evaluated, it's derived from people's evaluations of the benefits from an action. That is, from a production process. It's derived from people's evaluations of the value that is created. On the other hand, this side, total cost, that is the expenditures on inputs. That is, it's the expenditures or it's the value that they could have created in alternative uses. It's what else we could have done. We've taken it away from that, and so we have to deduct that. And so if this thing is if this thing is positive, that means that the action has created net value. We've taken stuff that had less value and converted it into something that has more value. That is the economic meaning of profit. Conversely, if we have this as a loss, if this thing is negative, that means we've taken stuff that was valuable and converted it to something that is less valuable than what we may be valuable, but it's less valuable than what we started with. And so we have taken a loss. Well, it's desirable to not do that. It's desirable to have this thing be positive, not negative. And that's what a market system incentivizes. Great, well, I think that's what I more or less just said here. I should emphasize something though, because people who don't understand economics at all, sometimes imagine that what profit means is that you've got a set of costs and then you simply tack a number on and you call that profit. That's just some additional residual. That's why I've sometimes heard people say, heard friends of mine who don't know anything about economics say, well, isn't profit, if the government does something, it must be cheaper, right? Because the government doesn't have to turn a profit. They don't have to add a profit onto it, so it must be, well, no, that's not actually the way that it works. This misses the idea of what profit actually is. Great. So I guess the other thing I'll say about market allocation is that it requires individual freedom. It requires individuals to be able to have the right to own property, the right to direct it, the right to exchange it, the right to utilize it. Furthermore, it requires you to have consumers who are free to take it or leave it. They can either buy or not buy the things that are offered. That's why that total revenue side reflects consumer evaluations. Great. So pop the slide here. And let's contrast that then with socialist allocation. And by socialist allocation, what I mean is central economic planning, central direction. With central direction, individuals, experts, someone formulates a plan, and then individuals within the society follow that plan. Socialism is not going to be compatible in that case with individual choice or with individual freedom. The plan is set out, we're going to do away with market allocation and instead replace it with central direction by experts. Then I put a couple of ideas here. But obviously it requires the following of the plan, and hence it's sometimes called a command and control economic system. And that's what we're contrasting. Now, one of the problems with this is that, I'm going to pop back a slide or two if I can, is that in the absence of market prices, there's no way to calculate whether or not what these opportunities are that have been foregone here. We can calculate perhaps what we can evaluate something we've achieved, but we can't tell for sure what the consumers think of it. But we also have no way without those market prices to calculate what the value foregone is. That's called the calculation problem within economics. And it's one of the reasons, one of the primary reasons, that historically socialist systems have failed to deliver the goods economically and have had inferior economic performance. Great. By abolishing markets, socialism has no way to tell if it is creating net value or not. If I were to now launch into my lecture on the Soviet Union, I'd give you a history of 70 years of central planning and how they were unable, and admitted that they were unable to tell this once they got rid of prices as signals of value. But at heart, what's really at stake here is that central planning requires following of the plan. It's not compatible with liberty. It's not compatible with individual freedom. And socialism, therefore, necessarily ends up having to concern itself with changing individuals' behavior, changing their thinking, changing their beliefs, and changing their values, so that they will follow the plan. It's one way that you get them, because you can't simply compel people to do anything. Sometimes this is stated explicitly in socialist thinking. So the Soviets spoke about creating a new Soviet man. There's language about creating a new socialist man or a new socialist woman. Now, what I'm going to argue is that some of our recent proposals for addressing climate change have this embedded in them. And we'll see, so we're going to see if I'm right, that some of these things are actually what I think of as a Trojan horse for promoting socialism. That's my hypothesis. So let's look at a few of them. And I'm going to stop just for a second. Can you ask economics questions? Great, let's proceed. You guys are even more silent than my afternoon history of thought class that comes out of lunch these days. Maybe it's just me. Couldn't be. All right, let's continue. What was I? Oh, I wanted to talk about a couple of. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. And first, I want to talk about some examples from the radical left. When I say radical left, I do not mean this as pejorative. This is the way that they describe themselves. And so I want to start out with a couple of economists, Enno Schroeder and Servaas Storm. Picture of him from his website. They're academic economists. Both of them are at Delft University in the Netherlands. And they do describe themselves as radical left. They're active with the Union of Radical Political Economists, which is an academic group that promotes Marxist economics. I've actually sat in on one of their sessions at the American Economic Association meetings. In a series of papers, these economists have made the following arguments. They've said that, first of all, market-based economies cannot solve the problem of anthropogenic global warming, that just cannot be done. And secondly, that therefore, governments must take over economies worldwide. And governments must shut down fossil fuel industries and then engage in massive development of wind and solar energy. And then finally, the fifth point is that the governments must begin reorienting production, and in particular, so that it is not being consumer-driven. It can't be consumer-driven. And they compare this to what they call a global Apollo program. And that's an analogy that I want to address later. So the Apollo program, of course, the moon mission that the United States had during the 1960s. These economists don't provide particular plans for this. They simply argue that this is necessary, and they go through some economics arguments for that. But they do explicitly call for an end to the market economy and for replacing it with government-directed central planning, and they say that this should be done quickly. Now, when I say there's no particular plan, there's one important thing that I think that they don't talk about, which I think is crucial in this, but there's no attention to how a country such as China or India might be persuaded to get involved in this. No attention to what would induce developing countries to participate in something along these lines. And that actually seems quite crucial to me, because they are calling explicitly for an end to economic growth as a goal, and especially for an end to rising consumer incomes. Now, if you're going to induce the Chinese government to do something, you're going to have to get around that and explain to them why they should accept this. Similarly for India and other developing parts of the developing world. But clearly, what they're endorsing is socialism. Excuse me, they don't make any bones about it. So there's an example. Let's move then to the United States. And there's an organization called the Sunrise Movement. I was going to put their logo up, but they had a picture. And I love the socialist art and kind of the style here. So I like the picture. So I was wondering if that was a slide rule, but on close examination, I don't think it is. There may be one or two people here who actually know what a slide rule is. I do, but at any rate. Anyway, where was I? Sunrise Movement. Well, you've heard of this group, because this is the group that occupied the hallways outside of Nancy Pelosi's office in Washington, D.C. Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez accompanied them and demanded the Green New Deal. Well, this organization is patterned after the Occupy movement, and it has been successful in raising over $1 million in funding, and that includes, they were actually kind of helped along getting started by the Sierra Club that has helped fund them. Currently, they are sponsoring a Green New Deal tour in town halls. So they are major proponents of the Green New Deal. And I'm going to talk about the Green New Deal in a little bit of detail later. So I won't say much about it now, except that to say that effectively it is a framework for implementing the kinds of things that Schroeder and Storm have called for. And so we'll return to that. We'll return to that issue. Another organization that is even more radical is the Climate Justice Alliance. And this is a collection of environmental justice organizations, as they call themselves. And this group is explicitly anti-capitalist. Now, it's very common with many of the socialists. They are not clear at all what they mean when they say that they're going to replace it. They don't say what they're going to replace it with, but it's what they call a regenerative economy. And that is based on principles such as, they say it would be based on caring and sacredness instead of the current colonial mindset, cooperation instead of current exploitation, deep democracy instead of militarism, and they call for what they call meaningful work and traditional ways of life. They especially promote indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' lifestyles. Another thing that they promote is solidarity, and this is the intersectionality that is common to people on the far left. And something else that they promote is buen vivir. Buen vivir. You're familiar with buen vivir? Someone must be. I didn't know what it was, and I kept coming across it in researching this topic, and I looked it up. But they have this is the first principle that they lay out as something that they are following. And you'll excuse me, but my Spanish is worse than my Latin, and those are terrible for me. But I think it means good life, yes? Good living, good, all right. I thought that was something my mother subscribed to. Never mind. Never mind. So, good living, buen vivir. Well, actually, I looked up, it's a philosophy that combines, as one of the founders describes it, postmodern critiques of capitalism with what they allege are the tribal values of Ecuadorian Indians. And as this organization puts it, the rights of peoples, communities, and nature must supersede the rights of the individual. I looked up, found a piece by one of the developers of this philosophy, Eduardo Gudinas, and he concurs with this definition. So I want to digress slightly and just talk a little bit about something we see here, because I think this kind of an approach is important to much of this green socialist argument. What they're doing here is reifying peoples and communities and nature and treating them as if they are a being or an individual that has rights, goals, and purposes. And I'm going to say that these are no such thing. A community is a group of people. It's actually what it is a community is a set of relationships among individuals. A community or people has no existence apart from the individuals who are making it up. So to treat these in this way, to talk about these kinds of terms, it's really a shorthand. To say we have a community or something is a shorthand for the relationships among all the peoples that are included in that, all the individuals are included in that. I'll simply point out that relations don't have rights. If we argue otherwise, we have entirely changed the meaning of rights. And the same holds true for nature. The rights of nature is a meaningless term. Nature itself is poorly defined. Are humans a part of nature or not? And we can have arguments about that and what we mean by it, but the point is that these are somewhat ad hoc terms. We define them how we wish, but it's not something that exists in and of itself. Now, I mention this because much of what I think much of what the climate socialists propose is poorly defined and ill-considered along these lines. I want to move to another point that the Climate Justice Alliance makes, And I think this slide is just a filler slide, but, and this is opposition to solutions that involve, opposition to solutions that involve removing carbon from emissions or removing carbon from the atmosphere. And one member of this, Kali Akuno, who is director of the CJA affiliate Cooperation Jackson, that's Jackson, Mississippi, warns that, quote, the left needs to intervene to assure that the Green New Deal does not become green capitalism. And she explicitly criticizes the ideas of market incentives for entrepreneurship that might be used to develop green technologies that would not pollute. Also explicitly criticizes the idea of carbon removal from the atmosphere. These are not the kinds of solutions that are desired. She also calls for the abolition of patents, for decolonization. Decolonization means the return of land, the United States, to the American Indians. Reparations, financial reparations, public banking as a step towards the eventual elimination of finance and presumably money. Now, okay, this is quite other things, but this is quite radical stuff. But this is, after all, the admitted, this is the radical left, and they say this is, of course, what we are, and so it's not a surprise. So the question is this just a fringe position? Because we always have leftists among us. Let's next look at a few things that have been proposed by the IPCC. And I think everyone knows what the IPCC is, but that's just to make sure. That's a UN body, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the IPCC report, SR 15, which came out on October 8th of last year. And as you will see, many of the proposed actions and solutions mirror the positions of Schroeder and Storm and the ideas of Sunrise and CJA. So let's proceed with that. And they begin by calling for a target temperature increase of a ceiling of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Instead of the 2 degrees, previously many of the international discussions revolved around the possibility of a 2 degree ceiling. And now this lowers it to a 1.5 degree ceiling. But the first chapters address this, talk about possible consequences, they predict then warming, and they say we really have about 12 years to tackle this problem. Chapters 4 and 5 are what lay out what the IPCC proposes should be done. And so they begin by calling for a number of things. And this is language taken directly from their report. So they call for fundamental transformations of societies. They do call for governments to begin to redirect economies. And most of Chapter 5 is about pursuing non-climate goals, and in particular the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs sometimes called. And if we look closely at what those are, many of them are the social justice goals of the left. So let's look at a few of the things that are proposed here. Some fundamental points. These are mostly from Chapter 4, but governments worldwide, IPCC says, must redirect finance. That's their terminology. The finance of economic activity cannot be left to the market, an individual choice, so governments will have to step in. And this also holds for saving. So government planners are going to determine saving and investment. The IPCC also says that price changes, so we would think of in a sense taxes and subsidies, price changes will be insufficient to affect change. They don't give an explanation for why this is so, but this is covered in Chapter 4. The fundamental point, though, that I want to make is that if governments redirect finance, if governments direct finance, then they choose what gets produced, and they get to choose how much is produced. And so that's socialism. That is central economic planning instead of market direction. But there's more. Demand management is another thing that